The crowd around the fire pit went silent the moment Jasper Hayes's boots stopped moving, and every eye in that orc war camp fixed on him like he was already dead. "Kiss her," Thok said again, shoving Jasper forward with a laugh that rattled the tusks in his jaw. "Kiss the bloodhorn, little man, or crawl back to your inn and tell your customers you pissed yourself before a woman twice your size." Jasper's heart slammed against his ribs, so hard he thought the whole camp could hear it over the crackling fire. 40 feet away, seated on an overturned barrel with a hunk of roasted meat forgotten in her hand, sat Bagrak Bloodhorn, the fiercest warrior of the Ashfang warband, watching him with dark eyes that missed nothing. Firelight caught the old battle scars crossing her jaw and throat, caught the tight leather of her warrior's bodice laced snug over broad, powerful shoulders, caught the twin curved horns rising from her temples like something carved from midnight stone. She did not look amused. She did not look angry either. She looked like a woman who had heard this exact dare 100 times and was tired of watching men fail it. Jasper had walked 11 miles across open moorland, past the standing stones the locals called the Nine Sisters, straight into an armed camp of orcs who by every rule of the world had every reason to gut him where he stood, and now a pack of laughing young warriors wanted him to die kissing their deadliest fighter for sport. He should have refused. He should have turned around and walked back into the mist. But he had come to this camp for one reason only, and it was not to be a joke around a campfire, and something in him, some stubborn, foolish, hopeful thing, that had lived quiet and unspoken in his chest for over a year made his feet carry him forward instead of back. "I did not come here for games," Jasper said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Then why did you come, little innkeeper?" Thok sneered, circling him with the easy menace of a wolf that knew it had already won. "Walking into our camp alone, unarmed, smelling of ale and fear. Either you are the bravest fool on this moor or the stupidest." "Maybe both," Jasper said. That got a laugh from the ring of warriors, but not from Bagrak. She had risen from the barrel now, and even that simple motion drew every eye in the camp, the way a drawn blade draws eyes. She was tall enough to look down at most men, built with the kind of raw, honed strength that came from a lifetime of the sword rather than the forge, and she moved like she had never once in her life doubted where her feet would land. "Enough," she said, and the word cut through the crowd's noise like a blade through canvas. "Thok, step back." "Come on, Bagrak," Thok said, grinning wide. "It is only a game. The little man wants to prove himself. Let him try. If he is fool enough to walk into an orc camp uninvited, he can be fool enough to kiss the bloodhorn and take his beating after." Bagrak's eyes slid past Thok and settled on Jasper's face, and something changed in them, something sharp and sudden, like a door swinging open on a hinge that had not moved in a long while. Jasper felt his breath catch. He knew that look. He had seen it once before, over a year ago, in the low lantern light of his own tavern, on a night when a wounded stranger had come stumbling out of a storm and changed the whole shape of his life without either of them saying a single word about it after. "You," Bagrak said quietly, and the single word carried more weight than anything Thok had shouted. "Me," Jasper agreed, and something in his chest eased even as his pulse kept hammering. Thok, sensing he was losing his audience, grabbed Jasper's shoulder and shoved him another step forward, right into the space between the fire and the woman. "Go on, then. Kiss her, or admit you are nothing but a coward wearing a brave man's boots." Jasper looked up at Bagrak Bloodhorn, fiercest warrior of the Ashfang camp, a woman who could break his spine across one knee without breathing hard, and he opened his mouth to say something. He never after could remember what, some half-formed apology or explanation or plea, and she did not let him finish it. Bagrak closed the distance in one stride, fisted her hand in the front of his worn traveling coat, and kissed him first. The camp erupted. Somewhere behind him, Thok made a sound like he had swallowed his own tongue. Someone dropped a wooden bowl. A dog started barking near the horse line. But all of it came to Jasper from very far away, muffled and distant. because the only thing that existed in that moment was the warmth of her mouth against his, fierce and certain and hungry, in a way that told him she had been waiting for this far longer than the length of one dare, and the rough, calloused hand still fisted in his coat, holding him steady like she was afraid the moment would slip away if she let go. When she finally pulled back just far enough to look at him, her eyes were bright with something that was not quite triumph and not quite tears. "I told you I would find you again, Jasper Hayes," she said low, for him alone, even with half the camp gawking. "I did not think you would be foolish enough to come find me first." Jasper let out a breath that shook on its way out. Someone had to. Around them, the young warriors who had set up the dare stood frozen, staring, and Thok's mocking grin had crumpled into something much smaller and much more afraid. Because everyone in that camp had just learned in the space of 10 seconds that the human they had been baiting for sport was not a stranger to their fiercest warrior at all. He was hers. The story of how Jasper Hayes came to be standing in an orc war camp on the misty moor, being kissed breathless by the most feared warrior in it, began 14 months earlier, on a night when the wind screamed sideways across the moorland, and rain came down like the sky itself had turned to iron nails. Jasper kept the only inn for 11 miles in any direction, a low stone building called the Stoneway, set at the crossroads where the trade road from the coast met the drover's track running up into the high moor. It had been his father's inn before it was his, and his grandfather's before that, 3 generations of Hayeses pouring ale and letting rooms to drovers, tinkers, tax collectors, and the occasional lost soul who had misjudged the moor's tempers. Jasper was 31 years old, broad in the shoulder from years of hauling barrels and splitting wood, quiet by nature, and entirely alone in the world since his mother had died of the winter fever 3 years past. He was not a man anyone in the nearby villages thought twice about. Reliable, they called him. Steady. A good man to fetch when your wagon wheel broke, forgettable the rest of the time. That night the storm had driven every sensible traveler off the road hours before dark, and Jasper had been banking the fire and thinking of nothing more exciting than his cold supper when the door of the Stoneway had slammed open and a woman had half fallen through it, streaming rain and blood in equal measure. She was enormous by any human measure, tall and broad-shouldered, green-gray skin gone pale with blood loss, a nasty gash torn along her ribs where a spear or blade had caught her, and even wounded and dripping she had looked at him with such fierce, wary pride that Jasper's first instinct had not been fear at all, but something closer to awe. "I mean you no harm," she had said, one hand pressed to her side, the other still holding the hilt of a broken sword like she expected him to attack. "I only need shelter from the storm. I will pay." "You are bleeding," Jasper had said, which was, he later realized, a spectacularly useless thing to say, but it was the only thing his mind had offered him. "I am aware," she had said, with a dry edge that told him she was more annoyed at her own weakness than afraid of him. He should have turned her away. Orcs were not welcome in most villages along the moor road, not since the border wars 2 generations back, and there were men in the taproom villages who would have burned the inn down around her ears rather than let her rest under its roof. But Jasper had never much cared what men in taproom villages thought, and there was a wounded woman bleeding on his floor, and so he had done what his mother had taught him to do for any hurt creature that came through his door. He had helped her. Her name, she told him grudgingly as he worked a needle and thread through the gash in her side by lantern light, was Bagrak Bloodhorn, and she had been ambushed on the moor road by bandits who had mistaken her for easier prey than she was. She had killed 3 of them and still lost the fight to blood loss and exhaustion, and she had crawled the last mile to his door more out of stubbornness than hope. "You could have let me die on your doorstep," she had said, watching him work with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "It would have been easier." "I do not do things because they are easy," Jasper had said. She had studied him for a long moment after that, the way a hawk studies something it has not yet decided is prey or not, and then, unexpectedly, she had laughed, a low, rough, real laugh that had startled them both. "You are either the kindest man on this moor, or the stupidest," she had said, echoing words she would not say again to him for over a year, on the night he walked uninvited into her camp. "Maybe both," he had answered then too, and something had passed between them in the lantern light that neither of them had a name for yet. She had stayed 3 days while her wound closed enough to travel, sleeping in the small room above the tap room that Jasper usually kept for drovers, and in those 3 days they had talked more than Jasper had talked to another living soul in years. She told him about her clan, the Ashfang war band, driven from their old grazing grounds 2 seasons back by a hard winter and harder men, now camped somewhere out on the high moor near the standing stones while their war chief decided where next to settle. He told her about the inn, about his father's death and his mother's death, about the particular loneliness of pouring ale for strangers night after night and going to bed alone in a house too big and too quiet for one man. She had listened to him the way no one had listened to him in years, without pity, without impatience, simply listened. And by the second night he had found himself telling her things he had never said aloud to anyone. On the third night, with her wound closed to a thin pink scar and her strength mostly returned, she had stood in his doorway at dawn, dressed once more in her travel leathers, and looked at him for a long moment. "I do not know how to thank a man for saving my life," she had said. "My people do not owe debts easily." "You do not owe me anything," Jasper had said. "I would do it again." She had reached out then, unexpectedly, and pressed something small and hard into his palm, a carved bead of dark antler bone, etched with a jagged rune he did not recognize. "This marks a debt unpaid between my clan and a friend," she had said. "If you ever need help, Jasper Hayes, show this to any Ashfang warrior, and they will owe you the same kindness you showed me." Then she had walked out into the gray morning mist and was gone, and Jasper Hayes had stood in his doorway for a long time afterward, turning the bead over and over in his fingers, feeling like something enormous had passed through his life and left an ache behind it that he had no way of naming. He had not seen her again for 14 months. He had told himself in the long, quiet nights that followed that she had likely forgotten him entirely, that a war band's fiercest warrior had no reason to remember one small kindness from one small innkeeper on one storm-lashed night. But he had kept the bead on a leather cord around his neck anyway, tucked beneath his shirt where no customer would see it and ask questions. And some nights, pouring ale for strangers, he had found himself thinking of dark eyes and a low, rough laugh, and wondering where on the wide moor Bagrac Bloodhorn had gone. The purge came to the moor the spring after that storm, riding in on the authority of a hard-eyed man named Warden Roderick Blackwell, who arrived at the Stoneweight crossroads with a company of gray-cloaked men, and a writ from the crown declaring open hunt on any unnatural creature or consorting sympathizer found within the border shires. The writ was vague enough to mean whatever Blackwell wanted it to mean, and Jasper watched with a cold, sick feeling in his stomach as the meaning widened week by week. First orcs, then hedge witches and midwives who knew too much of herb craft, then simply anyone the wardens decided looked at them wrong. Blackwell himself stopped at the Stoneweight more than once that spring, a lean, precise man with pale eyes and a voice that never rose above a murmur even when he was threatening to burn a man's house down around him. And each time he stopped, he asked Jasper the same questions. "You sit at a crossroads, innkeeper," Blackwell said one gray afternoon, warming his gloved hands at Jasper's fire while his men watered their horses outside. "Everything that moves on this moor passes your door eventually. Orc war bands, wandering hedge folk, anyone sheltering what they should not. I run an inn," Jasper said carefully. "I serve ale to travelers and let rooms to drovers. I do not ask my customers their business." "No," Blackwell said, studying him with those pale, unblinking eyes. "I imagine you do not." He had not pressed further that day, but Jasper had felt the weight of his suspicion linger like smoke long after the wardens rode on, and he had known, With the same cold certainty a man feels watching a storm build on the horizon, that Blackwell's purge was not going to stop with midwives and hedge witches. It was going to reach the Moors' orc camps eventually, and when it did, it would not be a fair fight. That certainty was what finally sent Jasper walking 11 miles across open moorland with nothing but a walking stick, a water skin, and a carved bead of antler bone on a cord around his neck. Because 3 days before he had heard from a passing drover that Warden Blackwell had gathered a force of nearly 40 men, and was marching toward the high moor where an orc warband called the Ashfang clan had made their camp near the Standing Stones, and Jasper had known the name Ashfang, had thought of dark eyes and a low, rough laugh, and had not been able to sit behind his bar and pour ale for anyone while that happened. So he had walked and found the camp, and been dragged before a laughing ring of young warriors who wanted to see him, humiliated for sport, and been kissed breathless by the one woman on the whole moor he had spent 14 months failing to forget. Bagrak led him away from the fire, and the gawking crowd with one hand still fisted possessively in his coat, past hide tents and cook fires, to a smaller fire near the edge of the camp where an older orc with gray-streaked tusks and a face seamed with old scars sat sharpening a spear point with slow, deliberate strokes. "Warlord Crega," Bagrak said, and something in her voice shifted, respectful but not deferential, the voice of a warrior addressing her chief rather than a girl addressing her father. "This is Jasper Hayes. He is the innkeeper I told you of, from the storm a year past." Crega's dark eyes moved over Jasper slowly, taking in the mud on his boots, the exhaustion in his face, the 11 miles of open moor he had clearly just walked. "The one who sowed your side and asked for nothing," he said. It was not a question. "The same," Bagrak said. "And why has he walked into our camp uninvited, risking his life among strangers who owe him no kindness?" Crega asked, though his gaze had already returned to his spear point, as if he already suspected the answer and found it unremarkable. "Because there is a force of 40 armed men marching on this camp with orders to kill everything in it," Jasper said, and the words came out rough with the effort of the walk and the fear he had been carrying since the drover's news 3 days before. "Warden Blackwell's wardens. They are 2 days behind me, maybe less. I came to warn you." The camp around them had gone quiet again, warriors drifting closer to listen, and Crega finally set down his spear point and looked at Jasper with the full weight of his attention. Why would a human walk 11 miles to warn an orc camp of a human army's approach? Jasper looked at Bagrak before he answered, because the true answer belonged to her as much as to the warlord, and found her watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like fear, though he knew better than to think Bagrak Bloodhorn feared very much in this world. "Because I have spent 14 months trying to forget a woman who sewed her own life back together on my floor rather than ask a stranger for pity," Jasper said. "And I failed. And I was not going to sit safe behind my bar while men marched to kill her for the crime of existing." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Jasper felt his pulse hammering in his ears, and then Crega let out a short, rough bark of a laugh and shook his gray head slowly. "Bagrak," he said, "your innkeeper has more courage than sense." "I told him that once already," Bagrak said, and there was something almost fond in her voice now, though her jaw was tight with worry. He did not listen then either. That night the war camp did not sleep much. Crega called his war council together around the largest fire, a dozen scarred warriors, Bagrak among them and Jasper sitting slightly apart, tolerated but not yet trusted, listening as they argued over maps scratched into the dirt with a knife point. "We could break camp before they arrive," said an older warrior named Uagash, arms crossed over a barrel chest. "Scatter into the high moor. Blackwell's men do not know this ground the way we do." "And go where?" Bagrak said sharply. "We have already been driven from 3 grazing grounds in 2 years. There is nowhere left on this moor for us to run to that the crown has not already claimed. If we run now, we run forever until there is no ground left under our feet at all." "Better to run than to die," Uagash snapped back. Better to stand than to spend the rest of our lives running from men who will never stop hunting us, Bagrak said, and her eyes swept the council fire with the same fierce certainty Jasper had seen in her the night she stood bleeding in his doorway, refusing to ask for pity. This is our ground. We have earned it with blood and years. I will not hand it to Blackwell's greycloaks. Without a fight he will remember for the rest of his miserable life. Crega listened to both arguments with his old scarred face unreadable, and finally raised a hand for quiet. The camp is exposed on the moor, he said slowly, but the standing stones give us high ground and narrow approaches and cover for archers. If we must stand, we stand there. He looked across the fire at Jasper. Innkeeper, you know this warden. You have watched him work. What will he bring against us? Jasper thought of Blackwell's pale, unblinking eyes, of the writ that widened its meaning week by week, of the grim gray-cloaked column he had glimpsed on the road 3 days before. 40 men at least, he said. Trained soldiers, not militia. Crossbows. Some carry fire oil. I have seen the barrels on their supply cart. Blackwell believes fire cleanses what he calls unnatural taint. He will come at dawn, most likely, to catch you half asleep and unprepared. He is not a subtle man, but he is not a careless one either. And you, Crega said, why should we trust the word of a human who could just as easily be leading a trap of his own? Because he already bled to save one of us and asked nothing for it, Bagrak said, before Jasper could answer for himself, her voice hard with a warning that dared anyone at that fire to argue further. I trust him with my life. That will have to be enough for the rest of you. Crega studied his daughter for a long moment, for Jasper realized then, from the shape of the warlord's gaze, that this must indeed be her father, or near enough to it in the clan's reckoning. In something passed between them that Jasper could not read, old history and old worry compressed into a single silent look. Then we prepare for the stones, Crega said finally, and we pray your innkeeper's warning bought us enough time. The council broke apart into a flurry of preparation, warriors gathering weapons and supplies, runners sent to outlying grazing parties to bring them in before dawn, and in the chaos of it Bagrak took Jasper's arm and pulled him away from the fires, out past the edge of the camp to where the mist lay thick and silver over the open moor. You should not have come here, she said, but her hand had not left his arm, and her thumb moved once absently over the fabric of his sleeve, betraying a gentleness her voice did not carry. If Blackwell's men catch you with us, they will not care that you are human. They will call you a sympathizer and burn you alongside the rest of us. I know, Jasper said. Then why? Because I have thought about you every single day since you walked out of my doorway, Jasper said, the words coming out of him in a rush he had not planned. 14 months of careful, quiet longing finally breaking free of whatever dam had held it. I told myself it was foolish. I told myself a warrior like you had no reason to remember a man who only sewed a wound and asked for nothing. But I could not make myself stop, Bagrak. I did not walk here to warn a camp. I walked here because I could not bear the thought of you dying somewhere out on this moor without ever knowing that. Bagrak was silent for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face in the dim silver light, and when she finally spoke her voice had gone rough in a way he had not heard from her before, not even the night she bled on his floor and refused to admit how much it hurt. I kept your bead, she said. The one I gave you know. I mean, I have carried the memory of that night with me for 14 months, Jasper Hayes, longer than I have carried almost any memory I own. I told myself the same foolish things you told yourself. That a war band's fiercest warrior had no business thinking of one small kindness from one small innkeeper, night after night, for over a year. She let out a breath that shook slightly on its way out, an admission that cost her something to make. I am not gentle with people. I do not know how to be. Every warrior in this camp fears me, and most of them are right to. I did not think I had any right to want something as soft as this. I am not asking you to be gentle, Jasper said. I am asking you to let me stand beside you, whatever comes at dawn. She looked at him for a long time after that, and then, slowly, deliberately, she reached up and traced one rough, calloused finger along the line of his jaw, the way a woman touches something she has decided, finally, to let herself want. "Then stand beside me, Jasper Hayes," she said. "And if Blackwell's men come for this camp at dawn, know that I would rather die with you at my side than live safe and alone for another 14 months, wondering what I had thrown away." He kissed her then, softly, this time. None of the fierce urgency of the campfire kiss that had started this whole reckless collision of their lives. Just his mouth against hers in the cold silver mist, both hands coming up to cradle her scarred jaw like she was something precious rather than something feared. And Bagrak Bloodhorn, fiercest warrior of the Ashfang warband, melted into it with a small sound that had nothing of the battlefield in it at all. They did not sleep much that night either, though not entirely for the reasons either of them might have wished. Bagrak spent the dark hours helping haul supplies and weapons up to the standing stones, and Jasper worked alongside her, hauling water and sharpening blades and doing whatever small useful thing needed doing. And in the gaps between the labor she would find his hand, or press her shoulder briefly against his, small stolen touches that said more than either of them had words for yet. Dawn came gray and thin over the moor, mist still clinging to the low ground between the standing stones, and Warden Blackwell's 40 gray-cloaked men came with it, marching in tight disciplined ranks up the drover's track toward the 9 sisters with crossbows readied and fire oil barrels lashed to a supply cart at their rear. Jasper stood among the warband's warriors at the base of the standing stones, with a borrowed short sword in his hand that felt heavier and more foreign than any tool he had ever hefted in the Stonewait's kitchen. And beside him, Bagrak stood with her curved orc blade drawn and her dark eyes fixed on the approaching gray column, with an expression of cold, ready fury. "Stay behind the stones until the fighting closes," she told him, not looking away from the enemy line. "You are no soldier, Jasper. I did not bring you here to die proving otherwise." "I did not come here to hide," Jasper said. "You came here to live," Bagrak snapped, finally turning to look at him, something fierce and frightened warring behind her eyes. "That is not the same thing as dying bravely. Promise me you will use your head, not just your heart, when the blades come out," he almost argued. But the look on her face, raw, exposed, more afraid for him than she had ever let herself appear afraid for herself, stopped the words in his throat, and he nodded instead. "I promise." Below them, Warden Blackwell reined his horse to a halt at the base of the standing stones and raised his voice to carry across the mist. "By the authority of the Crown's writ against unnatural taint," he called, his pale eyes sweeping the warband arrayed on the high ground, "I call upon this camp to surrender itself for judgment. Resist, and you will be treated as the enemies of civilized order you have always been." "This ground belongs to my people," Krega called back, standing tall despite his gray years, spear planted in the earth beside him. "We have fought and bled and buried our dead here. We will not hand it to you for the crime of being born different than you." Blackwell's expression did not change. "Then you have made your choice," he said, and lowered his hand. The first volley of crossbow bolts came before Jasper had fully registered the order had been given, hissing up through the mist to clatter against stone and shield, and then the gray-cloaked line surged forward up the slope, and the world dissolved into noise and chaos. Jasper had never been in a battle before. He had broken up tavern brawls, hauled drunk drovers apart before fists could land, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer, overwhelming press of it, the screaming, the clash of steel, the smell of blood and fire oil thick in the misty air. He fought where he could, mostly defending rather than attacking, using the narrow gaps between standing stones the way Krega had planned, forcing Blackwell's men into single-file chokepoints where the warband's numbers mattered less than their positioning. But 40 trained soldiers against a warband of some 30 warriors, many of them elderly or wounded from the hard winters that had already driven them from 3 grazing grounds, was not a fight that could be won by clever positioning alone, and Jasper watched with growing horror as the Ashfang line began, slowly, to buckle under the weight of Blackwell's disciplined advance. A young warrior named Grishna fell near the third stone, a crossbow bolt through her shoulder. Uagash took a blade across the ribs and staggered back, bleeding heavily, still swinging his axe. The fire-oil barrels were being hauled forward now, and Jasper understood with cold clarity that Blackwell intended to burn the standing stones and everyone sheltering among them rather than risk a longer fight. Bagrak fought like something out of an old war song, cutting through Blackwell's front line with a ferocity that should have been impossible for one warrior to sustain. But even she was tiring. Even she was bleeding from a shallow cut along her forearm. And Jasper watched with his heart in his throat as 3 gray-cloaked soldiers converged on her position near the central stone, forcing her back step by step toward a rock face with nowhere left to retreat. He did not think. He simply moved, cutting through the chaos toward her, borrowed sword raised, and threw himself into the gap between Bagrak and the nearest soldier's blade a half-second before it would have opened her side. The impact staggered him. Pain lanced up his arm as he parried a blow he had no real training to parry, more instinct and desperation than skill, but it was enough to buy Bagrak the half-second she needed to spin and drive her own blade through the soldier's guard, and the second attacker fell to an arrow from somewhere above them, and the third broke and ran rather than face them both. Jasper! Bagrak's voice cracked with something raw as she caught his arm, checking him for wounds with frantic hands. "You fool, you utter fool, I told you to stay behind." "I told you I did not come here to hide," Jasper said, breathing hard, blood from a shallow cut on his own shoulder soaking through his sleeve. There was no time for more than that. The battle surged around them again, and they fought back to back through the narrow spaces between the 9 sisters, Bagrak's blade and Jasper's borrowed sword moving in a rough, instinctive rhythm that should not have worked as well as it did. And for a long, brutal stretch of time, it seemed the war band might actually hold the line. Then Warden Blackwell himself rode forward, pale eyes cold as winter stone, and called for the fire-oil barrels to be brought up to the central stone, and Jasper understood that if that fire caught, no amount of clever positioning or borrowed courage would save anyone on that hillside. "The barrels!" Jasper shouted to Bagrak, pointing through the chaos to where 2 soldiers were hauling the heavy fire-oil casks up the slope toward the stones. "If that oil catches, we lose everything. The whole hillside will burn." Bagrak's eyes tracked the barrels, calculating fast, and then she grabbed Jasper's good arm. "Can you reach them? Cut the ropes lashing them to the cart before they get them up the slope." "I can try." "Then go," she said, and there was a fierce, terrible trust in her voice, the trust of a woman who had decided, against every warrior's instinct toward caution, to let this one human she loved run headlong into danger because she truly believed, that he could do it. "I will clear your path." What followed was the wildest, most reckless 5 minutes of Jasper Hayes's entire life. Bagrak carved a path through the soldiers between him and the fire-oil cart, with a fury that made even Blackwell's disciplined line scatter before her. And Jasper ran through the gap she tore open, borrowed sword abandoned in favor of the small skinning knife. He always carried at his belt a tool for cutting rope and cleaning game, never meant for battle, but sharp enough for what he needed now. He reached the cart just as the 2 soldiers hauling the fire-oil barrels turned to face him, and rather than fight them, he had no illusions about winning that fight. He dove past them, rolled beneath the cart's axle, and cut through the leather straps lashing the remaining barrels to the wagon bed with 3 fast, desperate slashes. The barrels toppled and rolled down the slope, oil splashing harmlessly across wet moorland grass instead of catching flame against dry stone, and the soldiers' plan to burn the hillside collapsed in an instant of spilled oil and shouted curses. One of the soldiers rounded on him with a blade raised, and Jasper barely got his forearm up in time to deflect the blow, taking a shallow gash across his arm for his trouble, staggering back with pain lighting up his whole side. But then Bagrak was there, appearing out of the chaos like something summoned by his need, driving the soldier back with 2 brutal strikes and standing over Jasper with her blade raised, daring anyone else to come near him. "Get up," she said, hauling him to his feet with one strong hand, her dark eyes wild with fear and fierce pride in equal measure. "Get up, Jasper, we are not finished yet." With the fire oil spilled and useless, and Blackwell's front line disorganized by the loss of their planned advantage, the tide of the battle shifted. Not easily, not without further cost, but shifted. Crega rallied the warband's remaining fighters for a final push, and Warden Blackwell, watching his carefully planned assault collapse into chaotic melee, finally understood that the camp he had expected to slaughter unprepared had instead cost him dearly, and he was not a man who threw away resources on a fight already lost. "Fall back," Blackwell called finally, his pale eyes sweeping the bloodied hillside with cold calculation rather than defeat. "We will return with greater numbers." The gray-cloaked line broke and retreated down the slope, leaving their dead and several wounded behind, and the standing stones of the 9 Sisters fell quiet except for the ragged breathing of exhausted survivors and the low keening of those tending the wounded. Jasper sank down against the base of the central stone, his arm throbbing, his whole body shaking with the after-tremors of violence he had never trained for and barely survived, and Bagrak dropped to her knees beside him, checking the gash on his arm with hands that trembled despite their strength. "You reckless, impossible man," she said, tearing a strip of cloth from her own sleeve to bind the wound, her voice rough with an emotion that was not quite anger and not quite relief but some fierce combination of both. "You could have died. Do you understand that? You could have died cutting those ropes and I would have—" She stopped, jaw tight, unable to finish the thought. "I did not," Jasper said gently, reaching up with his uninjured hand to touch her scarred jaw. "I am here." "You are here," she agreed, and then unexpectedly she laughed, a rough, exhausted, disbelieving sound that had tears mixed into it, the laugh of a woman who had spent the worst hour of her life terrified of losing something she had only just let herself claim. "You walked into my camp and let a pack of fools dare you to kiss me, and then you cut fire oil barrels loose under enemy blades to save every life on this hillside. I do not know whether to strangle you or—" She did not finish that sentence either, choosing instead to kiss him again, softer this time despite the blood and the exhaustion, and the wounded warriors being carried past them on makeshift litters, a kiss that tasted of relief and fierce, fought for love rather than the desperate hunger of the campfire kiss that had started everything. Blackwell did not simply give up, of course. The world Jasper and Bagrak lived in was not so kind as that, and the days following the battle at the 9 Sisters were tense, uncertain days, filled with scouts sent out to watch the roads and warriors kept ready for a second assault that everyone feared and expected. Crega sent riders to other orc warbands scattered across the moor, calling for allies, and word came back slowly, cautiously, that other clans had heard of the fight at the Standing Stones, and were willing to send warriors to stand together against a purge that clearly intended to hunt every orc camp on the moor eventually, whether the Ashfang clan alone survived it or not. Jasper spent those tense days in the camp doing whatever was needed, tending wounds alongside the camp's healer, an old orc woman named Vashka, who grudgingly admitted his hands were steadier than most warriors, hauling water, mending torn tents, and slowly, gradually, being accepted by warriors who had watched him cut fire oil barrels loose under enemy blades, and could no longer dismiss him as simply Bagrak's strange human curiosity. Thok, of all people, was the one who finally approached him directly, some 4 days after the battle, finding Jasper alone by the horse line checking a bandage on his healing arm. "I owe you an apology," Thok said gruffly, not quite meeting Jasper's eyes. "The dare, it was meant to humiliate you. I did not think," he stopped, jaw working. "I did not think a human could care enough about one of us to risk what you risked." "I did not do it for approval," Jasper said, not unkindly. "No," Thok agreed. "I know that now, that is why I am apologizing." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "The camp does not forget a man who bleeds for it. You have earned your place here, innkeeper, however strange that place is." It was not a grand reconciliation, but it was honest, and Jasper found himself oddly moved by it, the same way he had been moved by small kindnesses his whole quiet life, not grand gestures, but simple, earned respect, freely given. That evening, Bagrak found him sitting alone near the edge of camp, watching the mist gather over the moor in the fading light, and settled beside him without a word, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his. "Crega has decided," she said after a moment. "We move the camp closer to the standing stones permanently, where the high ground favors defense, and we hold that ground with the allied clans when Blackwell returns. It will not be an easy life. There will be more fighting before this purge burns itself out." "I know," Jasper said. "You're in," she said, and there was something careful in her voice now, something that told him this question had been weighing on her. "You have a life there, a trade, a roof, a place in the world that does not require you to fight for it every season." "I had a life there," Jasper said. "A quiet, lonely life, pouring ale for strangers and going to bed alone in a house too big for one man." He turned to look at her, at the scars on her jaw and the fierce, dark eyes that had haunted him for 14 months, and felt something in his chest settle into place like a key finding its lock. "I would rather have this life, Bagrak. Whatever it costs. I would rather stand beside you on a hillside with the whole world against us than go back to pouring ale alone and wondering what I threw away." Bagrak was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again her voice had roughened with an emotion she did not often let show. "My people do not choose lightly, Jasper Hayes. When an Ashfang warrior claims a mate, it is not a thing done and undone on a whim. It is a binding that lasts. I need you to understand that before you say such things to me again." "I understand," Jasper said. "I am not saying it lightly." She studied his face for a long moment in the fading light, searching for whatever doubt or hesitation might still be hiding there, and finding none. Something in her seemed to finally, fully unclench some last guarded wall coming down after 14 months, and one desperate battle had worn it thin enough to break. "Then know this," she said, taking his hand in both of hers, rough calluses against his own work-worn skin. "I have fought beside 100 warriors in my life, Jasper. I have trusted my back to men and women I called kin. But I have never once, in all my years, wanted to build a life beside someone the way I want to build one beside you. You are not a warrior. You will never be the fiercest fighter in any camp, but you have more courage in your heart than half the blooded warriors I have ever fought beside, and I would rather have that than the sharpest blade on this moor." The second assault came 3 weeks later, and this time Warden Blackwell had learned from his failure at the Standing Stones. He arrived not with 40 soldiers but with nearly 80, reinforced from a garrison further south, along with 2 wagons of fresh fire oil, and a company of archers positioned to rain bolts down before any close fighting could begin. But this time, the Ashfang warband was not alone. Word had spread across the moor of the human innkeeper who had bled for an orc camp, of the fierce warrior who had chosen him openly before her whole clan, and 3 other warbands had sent warriors to stand at the 9 Sisters, drawn as much by the story of impossible defiance as by the practical need for allies against a purge that threatened them all equally. Jasper stood again among the standing stones as Blackwell's reinforced column approached, this time with Crega's blessing and a proper spear in his hand rather than a borrowed sword he barely knew how to use, Bagrak at his side as she had promised to be for every battle left in both their lives. "Are you afraid?" she asked him quietly as the gray-cloaked line began its advance across the misty moor. "Yes," Jasper admitted. "Good," Bagrak said, and there was something almost gentle beneath the fierceness of her voice. "Fear means you understand what you stand to lose. It is not weakness, Jasper. It is what makes a man fight to keep what matters instead of throwing his life away carelessly." She reached over and gripped his free hand once, briefly, fiercely. "Stay close to me. We end this fight together, or not at all." The second battle at the 9 Sisters was longer and bloodier than the first, but this time the numbers favored the warbands rather than Blackwell's wardens. And this time, Jasper fought not as a desperate amateur, but as a man who had learned, in 3 weeks of hard practice under Uagash's grudging instruction, how to hold a line and protect the warrior beside him without getting either of them killed. When Blackwell himself finally pushed forward near the height of the fighting, seeking to break the warband's resolve by striking at their most feared warrior directly, it was Jasper who stood in the gap beside Bagrak, spear leveled, refusing to yield an inch of ground even as the warden's own guard closed around them both. The final clash between Bagrak and Warden Blackwell was brief and brutal. Her blade found the gap in his guard that his cold, calculating pride had never expected to face, and he fell in the mud beneath the standing stones he had come to burn. And with their commander dead and their numbers broken by allied clans converging from 3 directions, the surviving wardens finally broke and scattered, fleeing south along the Drovers' Road and never returning to the moor again. The victory cost the warband's dearly. Warriors lost, wounds that would never fully heal, grazing ground scarred with the blood of a fight that should never have needed fighting at all. But it was, finally, a victory, and the purge that had swept the moor for a full bloody season finally burned itself out in the mud beneath the 9 sisters, leaving the standing stones to belong once more to the people who had bled to keep them. 3 days after the battle, once the wounded were tended and the dead properly mourned according to Ashfang custom, Bagrak found Jasper standing alone among the standing stones in the pale light of a clearing dawn, and something in the set of her shoulders told him this was not an idle visit. "Walk with me," she said. He followed her out past the edge of the camp, up the gentle rise toward the tallest of the 9 sisters, where the mist had burned away entirely under the climbing sun, and the whole sweep of the moor lay open and golden around them, empty of enemies for the first time in a full season. Bagrak stopped at the base of the stone and turned to face him, and Jasper saw that her dark eyes were bright with an emotion she was not bothering to hide anymore. "My clan has a custom," she said, "for a warrior who chooses a mate outside the warband. It is not done lightly, and it is not done often, but when it is done beneath open sky, before the old stones, so that the ground itself bears witness to the claiming." She reached up and unclasped a thin leather cord from around her own neck, one Jasper had not noticed before. Hidden beneath her collar and on it hung a small carved bead of dark antler bone, etched with a jagged rune he recognized instantly, because it was the twin of the one that had hung against his own chest for 14 months. "You kept one for yourself," Jasper said, throat tight. "I carved 2, the night I left your inn," Bagrak admitted. "I told myself the second was for luck. I did not let myself admit, for a very long time, that it was because some part of me already knew I would come looking for you again, whether I meant to or not." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, close enough that the whole wide moor around them seemed to fall away into nothing but the 2 of them and the old stone standing witness above. "I am not a gentle woman, Jasper Hayes. I do not know how to give my heart in small, careful pieces. When I claim something, I claim it wholly, or not at all." "Then claim me wholly," Jasper said, his voice rough with everything 14 months and one desperate war had built between them. "I am not asking for careful, Bagrak. I never was." She kissed him then, beneath the open sky and the tall standing stone, with none of the desperate urgency of the campfire dare or the fierce relief of the battlefield, but something slower, deeper, more certain, a kiss that felt like a promise being spoken in a language older than words, her rough hands framing his face like he was something precious and hard-won in equal measure. His own hands finding the strong line of her waist and pulling her close enough that he could feel her heart hammering as hard as his own. "I love you," she said against his mouth, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, like something she had never said to anyone before and had to force herself to say now. "I have loved you since a storm-wet night on your floor, Jasper Hayes, though it took me 14 months and a war to admit it even to myself. I do not intend to spend one more day pretending otherwise." "I love you," Jasper said back, and found the words came easier than he expected, easier than anything had ever come to him in his whole quiet, careful life. I think I loved you before I even knew your name. I just did not have the courage to say so until a fool dared me to kiss you in front of your whole camp. You did not kiss me first, Bagrak reminded him, a wicked, teasing warmth finally breaking through the raw emotion in her voice. I beat you to it. You did, Jasper agreed, laughing despite himself, despite the tears standing bright in both their eyes. You have been beating me to everything since the night you walked through my door bleeding and refused to ask for help. I do not mind losing that particular race, Bagrak Bloodhorn. I do not mind it at all. She laughed too then, a full, unguarded sound that he had only heard from her a handful of times in all the months he had known her. And the sound of it, out there under the open sky with the tall stones standing witness, and the whole more golden and quiet around them, felt to Jasper like the truest kind of homecoming he had ever known. They stayed among the standing stones long after the sun had climbed higher, wrapped together against the cool moorland air. And what passed between them there was not something Jasper would ever describe to another living soul, but it was tender and fierce in equal measure, a claiming freely given and freely returned, two guarded hearts finally letting each other all the way in beneath the old watching stones that had seen 100 generations of the moor's storms, and had never, perhaps, witnessed anything quite so gently fought for as this. In the seasons that followed, the Stoneweight Inn at the crossroads did not stand empty and quiet the way it once had. Jasper kept the place still, because it was his father's and his grandfather's before that, and because the crossroads needed a waystone for weary travelers same as it always had. But he no longer poured ale alone in a house too big and too silent for one man. Bagrak Bloodhorn, fiercest warrior the Ashfang warband had ever raised, split her seasons between the high moor camp near the Nine Sisters and the low stone inn at the crossroads, and travelers who stopped at the Stoneweight soon learned that the broad-shouldered orc woman behind the bar, sleeves rolled to show old battle scars, was not someone to trifle with, nor someone who would tolerate a single unkind word spoken against her innkeeper. The prejudice of the Moor villages did not vanish overnight. Old fears rooted deep do not uproot themselves in a single season. But the story of the battle at the Nine Sisters spread along the drovers' roads regardless. The story of an innkeeper who walked 11 miles unarmed to warn an orc camp of a coming purge. Of a fierce warrior who claimed him before her whole clan rather than let him walk away. And slowly, grudgingly, some of that old fear softened into something closer to respect. There were still men who muttered when Bagrak walked the crossroads market, still women who clutched their children a little tighter when she passed, but there were also drovers who had fought beside allied warbands at the Standing Stones and would hear no ill word spoken of the Ashfang clan in their presence. And slowly, season by season, the crossroads became a little less lonely a place for anyone who was different. On quiet evenings, when the taproom fire had burned low and the last travelers had climbed the stairs to their beds, Jasper and Bagrak would sit together by the hearth, her head resting against his shoulder, his fingers absently tracing the old scars along her forearm, and talk of nothing in particular the coming winter, a warrior's wedding up at the high camp, whether the Stoneweight's roof needed mending before the autumn rains. It was, Jasper thought more than once, the quietest kind of happiness he had ever known, and also the fiercest, because it had been fought for and bled for and claimed beneath open sky by a woman who could have chosen anyone in the world and had chosen, again and again, him. "You are thinking too hard," Bagrak murmured one such evening without opening her eyes, her voice warm and drowsy against his shoulder. "I can feel it. What troubles you, Jasper Hayes?" "Nothing troubles me," Jasper said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, feeling the low, steady thrum of contentment that had settled into his chest and refused to leave since the day beneath the Standing Stones. "I am only thinking that I spent 31 years believing this inn was my whole life, and I was wrong. It was only ever the place I was waiting in." "Waiting for what?" Bagrak asked, though her voice told him she already knew the answer and simply wanted to hear him say it. "For you," Jasper said. "I was always waiting for you, Bagrak. I just did not know it until you walked through that door bleeding in the rain and turned my whole quiet life inside out." Bagrak lifted her head then and looked at him with those dark eyes that had once been feared across half the moor, now soft with a love she no longer troubled herself to hide, and pressed her mouth to his in a kiss that held all the fierce, hard-won tenderness of everything they had survived together: the dare, the battle, the standing stones, and every quiet evening since. "Then it is fortunate," she said against his lips, "that I am not in the habit of leaving what I have claimed." Outside, the wind moved soft across the misty moor, past the crossroads and the old stone inn, out toward the standing stones where two clans now kept watch together over ground they had bled to protect. And the world, for once, felt steady and whole and unafraid, exactly the way Jasper Hayes had always hoped in his quietest, most secret heart that it might someday feel.